Can you all hear me if I speak without a microphone? Is this fine? All right. I would also like to extend my warmest thanks institutionally to the Catholic University in Lisbon, here represented by Her Excellency the Rector. I'm honored and delighted to be here. Now, my title, with that reference to early modern drama, promises a critical discussion of texts from 4 centuries ago. Now, that's an exercise that in the intellectual environment of the past 2 decades has been enveloped in a set of complex expectations. As pointed out by, among others, the late Terence Hawkes, reflective readers have faced in the late 20th and early 21st century a sustained call for historicizing their object of inquiry while hardly proving able to let go of their situatedness, as Hawkes phrases it, as a determinant of what he calls the selections and suppressions that regulate our dealings with the past, end quote. Now, in what follows, I will be doubly alert to the challenges posed respectively by the early modern text's temporal and cultural alterity and by an awareness that, again in Hawkes' words, we can only see the past through the eyes of the present. Now, let me then begin by briefly pondering, in a quasi-facetious way, the particularities of my circumstance, what I would like to call my place of reading, a phrase that I derive, in fact, from a title of a book by Seamus Heaney. My place of reading, well, I find myself here as a guest of an international summer school promoted by a prestigious academic consortium, addressing you at an extramural location that blends vaulted ceilings with, well, some postmodern apparatus, all the necessary technology, and all of this embedded in a renovated historic centre that has become the hub of a huge success story in global tourism. Indeed, the very conditions that allow us to converge for this event epitomize the ease with which we all avail ourselves of that mobility which has so fundamentally come to define the material apparatuses that organize our lives. And yet, mobility is a word that over the past decade has chimed with crises. Indeed, the largest crisis of human displacement on record, at least since World War II. This brings an additional challenge to my interest in pondering my circumstance, a humbling sense of how the comfort and ease of my cushioned mobility as I move down from Porto to Lisbon contrasts, rather sadly and starkly, with the adversities faced by hundreds of thousands whose forced mobility rather than voluntary mobility has become the most disturbing scenario of our age. Now, the responsibilities that such a scenario entails have, of course, been heatedly discussed from a variety of conflicting angles. Outside the more volatile ground of the global media and the instant responses they have obtained, public institutions have produced substantial overviews, such as this one, of such challenges, sometimes resorting to academic formats and venues to consolidate the conceptual means with which to confront them. And indeed, prior to the disasters that have marked the second decade of the new millennium, academic and critical discussion of the phenomena of human displacement and their broader role in shaping history and culture had already been intense, fostering plans for the development of mobility studies, such as Stephen Greenblatt's in Cultural Mobility, a Manifesto. In fact, in an earlier online version of his opening argument, Greenblatt had asked rhetorically, what if mobility were understood to be the constitutive condition of culture, not its disruption? This general claim, put forward by Stephen Greenblatt, was pondered in the collection with regard to the determining power that emplacement or displacement may have as regards identities, and aimed at an understanding of recent and current predicaments. Quote again, we need to understand colonization, exile, emigration, wandering, contamination, and unintended consequences, along with the fierce compulsions of greed, longing, and restlessness. For it is these disruptive forces that principally shape the history and diffusion of identity and language, and not a rooted sense of cultural legitimacy. The manifesto nature of Greenblatt's text targets academic culture as well, and the dominant frameworks of its modes of inquiry. he underlines that the established analytical tools have taken for granted the stability of cultures, and he associates the tendency to assume that a robust cultural identity requires emplacement, fixity, and coherence. And he associates the tendency to assume this with some of the foundational traits and historical vagaries that account for the modern university system and its schemata. And I quote, "Only the increasingly settled and bureaucratized nature of academic institutions in the 19th and early 20th centuries, conjoined with an ugly intensification of ethnocentrism, racism, and nationalism, produced the temporary illusion of sedentary indigenous literary cultures, making sporadic and half-hearted ventures toward the margins. The reality, for most of the past, as once again for the present, is more about nomads than natives." I'd like you to remember that final sentence there. Now, finally, and again with direct relevance to my concern today, Greenblatt's afterword, the manifesto proper, itemizes 5 attitudes as so many points in a program of action for mobility studies. And those attitudes include, for example, I'll just be browsing that, not reading it all out aloud. They include shedding light on hidden as well as conspicuous movements of peoples, objects, images, texts, and ideas, identifying and analyzing the contact zones where cultural goods are exchanged, pondering the tension between individual agency and structural constraint, and analyzing the sensation of rootedness, since it is impossible to understand mobility without also understanding the glacial weight of what appears bounded and static. These notions obviously exist in a very close rapport with the tropes for space and mobility that have prevailed in the discursive practices behind the rise of translation studies to its current privileged position as an area of disciplinary intersections. Indeed, we are reminded of these in the call for papers for this summer school, which cites several key contributions from recent intellectual environments to the conceptually empowering role that notions of mobility and transit have had in the delineation of translation studies, as indeed, in fact, some of the contributors to this program have extensively proved, among others, for example, Michael Cronin, who will be here later in the week with his books Across the Lines, Translation and Globalization, and Translation and Identity. I'm not going to offer an overview of these and other contributions, but I would rather like to take Greenblatt's point again about the past being more about nomads than natives, in order to vindicate again, with a certain sense of renewed urgency, a traditional claim of the humanities, that texts from the past, duly understood in their historicity, but inevitably reread in the light of current concerns, can provide us with expressive resources with which we can better confront our circumstance. The very act of reading those texts from the past in a distinct framework, temporal and cultural, promptly finds enabling homologies in translation. Indeed, displacing such texts involves knowingly considering and overcoming their remoteness, but also re-semanticizing them and endowing them with renewed but distinct rhetorical clout, that is, allowing the representations that they contain to acquire a reconfigured persuasiveness in the target context. This is compounded by specific historic traits when we are looking at texts from the early modern period, considering the comparatively swift transformations that the age experienced at all levels. Just a brief reminder, of course, we're talking politically about a period that saw the emergence of those new power conditions of Renaissance monarchies. This was the period, after all, that saw the rise and development of the modern state. We're talking about the conceptual shifts proper to the advent of the new science, of one piece with the epistemic changes that were to mark 17th century philosophy, and also of the adjusted ethical emphasis proper both to early commercial capitalism and the rise of the Protestant ethos in its varying sensibilities, with all the tensions these brought to social and interpersonal designs. With a particular intensity in the case of early modern England, this well-known scenario of accelerated change included demographic instabilities, as rural populations often saw their lifestyles and livelihoods disrupted by the impact on the countryside of the epoch-making transitions from a land economy to a money economy. The resulting displacement of individuals and groups led rather prominently to the growth of London and to the existence of a significant contingent of uprooted individuals, those vagabonds and sturdy beggars, this is a phrase from legislation of the period, whose capacity to induce anxiety in the state can be gauged by the insistence of Tudor legislators on the need to identify, immobilize and punish those who appear to have no fixed abode. I wouldn't have the time to go through any of those items of legislation in detail, but let me just give you a taste. This is from Henry VIII's 1530 proclamation against vagabonds. The king, our most dread sovereign lord, having always in his most blessed remembrance, as well the cure and charge of his dignity royal, as also the present estate of this his realm, and his subjects of the same, considereth that in all places throughout this his realm of England, vagabonds and beggars have of long time increased, and daily doth increase in great and excessive numbers, by the occasion of idleness, mother and root of all vices, whereby have insurged and sprung, and daily insurgeth and springeth continual thefts, murders, and other sundry heinous offences, and great enormities. Please remember this word, enormities. Great enormities to the high displeasure of God, the inquietation and damage of his true and faithful subjects, and to the disturbance of the whole commonweal of this his said realm. And then the proclamation goes on to determine that anyone caught in the position of a vagrant would have to be, arrested and then taken to the place where he or she had been living for the previous 3 years, if that was the case. Again, a few decades later, this is from a letter from Elizabeth I Privy Council, dated 1571, with instructions to apprehend all rogues, vagabonds, sturdy beggars, masterless men, and all persons otherwise suspected. All which so taken you shall cause to be punished by stocking and sharp and severe whipping, according to the laws effectually, and that without redemption or favour to their deserts, and after punishment due done to them to be conveyed from constable to constable, till they do come to their place of birth or last abode within 3 years, according to the statute. Now, as pointed out by Linda Woodbridge, among others, Tudor cultures exhibited this heightened and indeed disproportionate concern over the supposed dangers brought by tramps. Woodbridge, right from the beginning of the book, points out that so insistently did Renaissance writers hammer at the issue of vagrancy, so frenetically did the Tudors legislate against vagrancy that, the famous R.H. Tawney once famously concluded that, quote, the 16th century lived in terror of the tramp. And she goes on to point out that there is no historical evidence of any, hard, substantial reasons for these initiatives. Points out that not only was the response to vagrancy excessive, but it was also weirdly off-target, because a number of beliefs about vagrants current in early modern England have been shrewdly questioned and even wholly discredited by modern historians. The belief that vagrants, for example, were organized in highly disciplined societies or fraternities with kings and hierarchies of the underworld, that they schooled each other in a number of intricately graded criminal specializations, that they were politically seditious and economically radical scam artists, that they were sexually rampant and promiscuous, keeping women as sex slaves, that they were unemployed by choice, etc. Now, transgression, literally stepping or passing over a line, is in fact etymologically grounded on a fundamental understanding of mobility itself as an illicit human endeavor. This perception, however, and crucially for my concerns in this lecture, did not prevent vagrancy from becoming closely associated with the joyfulness of popular entertainment, some of which taking forms that in fact derived from rural cultures then undergoing a significant erosion. And of course, the rise of the literature of laughter, and this despite the evident gap between the miseries of vagrants' lives and the persistently comic aura surrounding them in literature and other arts. In fact, rogue literature became a fundamental myth-making engine as regards current beliefs on vagrants. The phrase myth-making engine is again from Linda Woodbridge. This is just an example, one item from rogue literature, this caveat or warning for common cursitors, vulgarly called vagabonds, set forth by Thomas Harman, Esquire, for the utility and profit of his natural country, augmented and enlarged, etc. etc. So this is one example of that. Itinerants invariably appear themselves as circulators of songs and ballads, chapbooks and almanacs, often welcomed as providers of entertainment, but perceived as, at best, poised on the outer boundary of the socially and legally acceptable. Just a few other title pages from this corpus of rogue literature. The importance of this for the emergence of early Elizabethan companies of players, the best of which ended up wearing the livery of prominent aristocrats, hence as their men or servants, as a protection precisely against accusations of vagrancy. That is too well known a chapter of literary and theatrical history to warrant more than a passing note at this point. But I want to argue that these conceptual and contextual traits that I've been mentioning should all prove productive at some level towards a reading of the play I'll be discussing, Ben Jonson's Bartholomew Fair, or as it would have been pronounced by Jonson and his contemporaries, Bartlemy Fair, first performed in 1614. Now, Jonson may seem a rather unlikely authorial presence to summon for a lecture involving notions of mobility and transit, because a lot of the man's critical reputation has historically involved the ostensible immobility and intractability of his positions on life, society, and human achievement, expressed across his work in general, but inscribed with particular clarity in his Timber or Discoveries, a rather orotund book of maxims, a repository of reflections on man and matters, that clearly spell out Jonson's views as a royalist, a classicist, and as regards literary politics, an avant-la-lettre upholder of strict canonical values. And this would seem to put him starkly at odds with the politics and ethics of postmodernity. I mean, consider the man's self-monumentalization, that title page of his works, the Jonson First Folio 1616. There, engraved with laurels, In fact, he was de facto the first laureate poet, within the English establishment. So this man would seem a rather unlikely presence here. He would not seem at all energized by a fascination for otherness and plurality. However, a large part of the critical processing of Jonson's work in the new millennium through, for example, books such as these, Refashioning Ben Jonson, Gender Politics and the Johnsonian Canon, Representing Ben Jonson, a lot of this critical processing, of this more recent critical processing, has involved reading him against the grain, reading him almost against himself, putting forward pleas for acknowledging the disorderly and subversive elements in his writing, and bringing in rather, and I quote, a new Jonson who is alert to the socio-political contingencies of his ages, a pluralist Jonson, a 21st century Jonson. Now, Bartlemy Fair, and by the way, this biography by Ian Donaldson that came out 6 years ago, and then the following year, the new Cambridge edition of the works of Ben Jonson, these have also been fundamental contributions to this process of critical vindication, central to which Bartlemy Fair has also acknowledgably been. Now, this is the last of the so-called 4 central comedies in the Jonson canon. It's a comedy that was pioneeringly read by Anne Barton in the early 1980s as the key piece of evidence for an argument that, in fact, from this point onwards, Jonson would have left behind a lot of his satirical intransigence and would have become the practitioner of a much more gregarious and benevolent comic mode. So the process of critical vindication that I'm talking about really began, a few decades ago with arguments such as these. And then in more recent critical environments, the play's multitudinous scenes, its indulged zest for rumbustious sexual and scatological language and plot incidents have enhanced its critical attractiveness. The defining conditions of the space against which most of the action of this comedy unfolds strongly contributes to this attractiveness. It's a space that epitomizes transit and transience. The fair, after all, exists for a short period every year. Its brief and precarious emplacement is made possible only by the displacement of the many individuals and groups, buyers and sellers, visitors and officials in charge of law enforcement, that move from the locations where they otherwise live and work to experience and possibly profit from this impermanent spot, the fair, on the periphery of the city. Smithfield, in fact, the site of the fair, if you look at, maps of, say, mid-16th century London, was already close enough, to open fields, and you see it represented there also with cattle on the move, to suggest that it is okay within easy reach of the city, but also already out there. Positioned beyond the boundaries and forms of institutional authority proper to the city with capital C, as the social and cultural source of judgmental and mostly hostile viewpoints on the leisures and pleasures of the fair. The hostility is recognizably that of the commonplace polarities of country versus city, magnified by the socio-economic changes proper to the development of that early commercial capitalism that found in London one of its privileged locations, enhancing, of course, the mistrust with which sober and tendentially Puritan city dwellers saw the rumbustious rural festive culture that survives in much of what is on offer at the fair. Further anxiety arose, of course, from the way in which the seasonal event provided pretext and license for a range of mobile individuals, sellers, ballad singers, and yes, conmen and thieves, sturdy beggars and vagabonds, to use those phrases from Tudor proclamations, that were thereby allowed to approach the boundaries of the city. When you look at the list of dramatis personae, you clearly see this polarity. I mean, if you look at the left-hand column, more or less down to the middle of it, you've got the characters that come from the city. John Littlewhit, his wife, Dame Purecraft. You've got a Puritan called Zeal of the Land, Beezy. You've got these young men, looking for wives, sometimes young women, sometimes widows, windwife and callers. You've got the judge, Adam Overdew, a justice of peace, Grace Wellborn and his ward. And then you start getting the people from the fair. Lantern Leatherhead, a hobby horse seller, Joe and Trash, a gingerbread woman, Ezekiel Edgeworth, a catpurse, Nightingale, a ballad singer, Ursula, a pig woman. Basically, she roasts pigs at the centre of the fair. Tapster, horse dealers, pimps, pardon my French, Punk Alice, mistress of the game, And then you've got, all the sellers and all the wanderers, that inhabit the space of the fair. Now, this list also signals an important element in the fair's imaginative appeal, which is its suggested universality. Because when you stage a circumstance that allows judge and cleric, lawyer and constable, gentlemen and their stewards, cooks and customers, buyers and sellers, pimps and prostitutes, a ballad singer, a madman, all of these converging for a few hours, well, Johnson is certainly tapping into allegorical habits of mind by hinting at the fair's ambition to stand for the world, as Smithfield, the location of the fair, in fact becomes, as in the famous line in the prologue of one of the best-known medieval poems in English, Langland's Piers Plowman, the fair becomes a fair field full of folk, involving both working and wandering, the final line there. But if the folk that converge onto Smithfield enjoy a measure of license to join that crowd, the field has its jurisdiction, called the Court of Pie Powders, a temporary court directly associated with mobility and transit, set up to administer justice in connection with transgressions imputed to those with dusty feet, because, of course, pie powders comes from French pieds poudreux, those with dust on their feet, from walking, from moving about, from engaging with mobility on their way to the fair. And they are beyond the scope, beyond the range of ordinary courts of law, but there's this temporary jurisdiction, the court of pie powders, the court for those with pieds poudreux. And in Johnson's comedy, the aptly named Justice Adam Overdue, wandering through the fair in disguise, expects to detect and sanction enormities, his word, for the huge transgressions that he also calls revealingly, I will later return to that, discoveries in this passage in which he announces his purpose. I, Adam Overdue, am resolved, therefore, to spare spy money hereafter, that is, not having to pay spies, to go into the fair and check things out. And I'll make mine own discoveries. Mine are the early enormities, many are the early enormities of this fair. In his courts of pie powders, I have had the honour during the 3 days, sometimes to sit as judge. But this is the special day for detection of those foresaid enormities. Now, these supposed enormities invariably turn out to be little things, the petty transgressiveness of those on the move to the fair or within the fair, misdemeanors arising from their desire for wealth, goods, social advancement, sex, or entertainment. Now, crucially for my argument, much of what happens in the fair arises from translation. And not just in the broadest of senses that allows us to use the word in connection with any process of communication, mobility, or exchange. For a play that is otherwise striking for its closeness to the world of traditional popular entertainment and stage laughter, Bartlemy Fair is also very much writerly, authorial, foregrounding ways in which writing acquires an enabling capacity, usually in vicarious ways, and often involving some form of mobility. You see, the play opens with the induction on the stage. What happens is you've got, in that sort of active prologue to the play, people coming on stage representing the playwright. The playwright is clearly furious about the way in which, so he believes, ignorant people have been bad-mouthing his output and saying bad things about his plays, and say, no, we've got to draw a contract of some sort, And so he sends out scrivener and bookholder before the play begins to draft, certain articles of agreement between the spectators or hearers at the Hope on the Bankside in the county of Surrey on the one party, and the author of Bartlemy Fair in the said place and county on the other party, the 1 and 30th day of October 1614. And so this is trying to find some sort of middle way with his audience. And he is also resorting to middlemen who will take care of the writing that will be required to produce that desired contact and agreement with his audience. Once these terms are agreed, the play opens in the house of a character called John Littlewhit. And John Littlewhit is a proctor. That is, someone legally empowered to go to court and represent or act as procurator for someone else. So here we have again writing skills exercised in a vicarious way. And Littlewhit is concerned very much with writing skills. In fact, he opens the play in a self-referential way with regard to language and to creative writing, we might call it. That opening statement there, this is the very beginning of the play. A pretty conceit and worth the finding. That is, he's saying, what a nice idea, what a nice image I've come up with, really worth the trouble of finding it, in the sense of getting something that an Italian would call ben trovato. A pretty conceit and worth the finding. And so from the outset, Littlewhit has this fascination for verbal creativity, which is of one piece with his ambition to disprove the littleness of his wit and to overcome, the secondariness and vicariousness of his function as a proctor, ordinarily defined by using language to represent what others mean and intend. And indeed, his opening address is all about himself as the source of verbal constructs for which he wants to obtain sanction and applause. He goes on, I have such luck to spin out these fine things still, and like a silkworm out of myself. There's the device, you know, another bentrofacto notion. Well, go thou thy ways, John Littlewit, Proctor John Littlewit. When are the pretty wits of Paul's, the little wit of London, so thou art called, and something beside, when a quirk or a quibbling does scape thee, and thou dost not watch and apprehend it, and bring it afore the constable of conceit, let them carry thee out of the archdeacon's court into his kitchen, and make a Jack of thee instead of a John. Now, it is hardly by accident that the play opens with this speech, because the relevance of this speech is not just thematic. In fact, the dynamics of the plot ultimately depend on the motivations that Johnson, with a measure of self-irony, attributes to Littlewit as would-be author. The move from the city to the fair after Act 1, you know, when the plot moves to the fair, it happens directly as a consequence of Littlewit's ambition to see his writerly talents recognized, because he has this dream of upward mobility along the scale of writerly recognition that is to be realized through outward mobility from his city-bound social and professional locale to the alternative space of the fair. And this is because Littlewit has written a play. He needs to see it acted. He wants to show the play to his wife. And for a complex of reasons, for this to be possible, a whole gallery of characters will have to be persuaded to move to the fair to gratify Littlewit's ambition and pride. Now, the type of play that Littlewit has authored brings in an additional set of ironical twists and proves key to my argument on mobility, translation, and satire. Littlewit tells his wife, I have an affair in the fair when a puppet play of mine own making. Say nothing, that I writ for the motion man, which you must see when. So he's written a play for a puppet theatre. But his authorial pride and inflated expectations regarding his personal success as a playwright appear impervious to a perception of how the reduced nature of such a context and its lowly position in the hierarchy of artistic forms reflect the littleness that he so wants to overcome. And on top of this, his play for the puppet theatre is, in a variety of ways, a translation, because in the run-up to the scenes that actually contain snatches of the puppet play within the play that Johnson embeds in Bartlemy Fair and that he attributes to his character Littlewit, it becomes clear gradually that Littlewit has used a book. They just refer to it as the book, as his source text. And also gradually we realize that the book in question is Marlowe's great narrative poem, Hero and Leander, of which actual snatches are quoted in the text of the comedy. While most of the plot, and certainly the language, are adapted for the production of what Littlewit intends as his opus magnum, and that Johnson crafts as a burlesque under the title The Ancient Modern History of Hero and Leander, otherwise called The Touchstone of True Love, with as true a trial of friendship between Damon and Pythias, two faithful friends at the bankside. What Marlowe had rewritten and made his own from classical sources, Johnson, through his character Littlewit, now translates intralingually and intergenerically, from a narrative poem to a stage play for the stage of a puppet theatre. And this translation is also emphatically defined as temporal, spatial, and cultural. Because when he is questioned on the relationship between the play about to be acted and the book, that is, Marlowe's narrative poem, there's that question, but do you play it according to the printed book? Lantern Leatherhead, the puppet master, explains how popular ignorance makes a rewriting inevitable. And he goes on to explain, by no means, sir. No, how then? A better way, sir. That is too learned and poetical for our audience. What do they know what Hellespont is? Guilty of true love's blood. These are snatches of Marlowe's writing. Or what Abydos is. Or the other Sestos height. That in the right. I do not know it myself. No, I have entreated Master Littlewit to take a little pains to reduce it to a more familiar strain for our people. So translation here becomes a form of debasement. And this provides the core for the satirical design served by the burlesque that Johnson ascribes to Littlewit. His project to reduce the narrative of Hero and Leander from the remoteness in time, place, and taste proper to an ancient tale of doomed lovers, to the current circumstances and familiar social types of contemporary London, serves in fact the denunciation by Johnson of the ability of our people and the times to enjoy anything more elevated than what would be adequate to a puppet theatre in Smithfield. And Littlewit himself explains the rationale. I have only made it a little easy and modern for the time, so that's all, as for the Hellespont, I imagine our Thames here. And then Leander, I make a dyer's son about Puddle Wharf, and Hero, a wench at the bankside who, going over one morning to Old Fish Street, Leander spies her land at Trickstairs and falls in love with her. Now do I introduce Cupid, having metamorphosed himself into a drawer, and he strikes Hero in love with a pint of sherry. I particularly like this, instead of an arrow or a dart, Cupid says, have a pint, and that does the trick, she will fall in love with the first guy who comes along, a pint of sherry. And he strikes Hero in love with a pint of sherry, and other pretty passages there are, the friendship that will delight you, sir, and please you of judgment. Now, earlier Lantern had praised Littlewit's version precisely for turning what was foreign into native. For him, a precondition for success and sure proof of how great or mickle, rather than little, the translator's talents really were. Your home-born projects prove ever the best. They are so easy and familiar. They put too much learning in their things nowadays, and that, I fear, will be the spoil of this. Littlewit, I say Micklewit, if not too mickle. Now, the debased and risible instance of domestication and localization that Littlewit's version brings to the puppet theatre evokes the controversies, of course, in early modern literary cultures surrounding the manner and extent to which the moderns could or should appropriate the ancients. Now, such concerns were central to the poetics of a staunch classicist and translator of classical texts, such as Johnson, who took pride, nonetheless, in the potential of English as a vernacular. English was, after all, the medium that allowed him to manifest his talent as the English Horace, the epithet with which his contemporaries alternately mocked and celebrated him. And this was to be visually realized, in fact, in the engraving that 3 years after Johnson's death fronted the 1640 edition of his translation of Horace's Ars Poetica, in which you've got, that bust. It identifies Horace there, but the features, the face, is really Johnson's, superimposed on Horace. Now, at a deeper level, an imaginative inability, if Johnson is attributing an imaginative inability to all these people in the fair to accommodate the remoteness of ancient history and culture, and he's satirizing this, he would also be satirizing an inability to understand and accept the existence of elsewhere, satirizing a narrowing of the imagination that becomes somehow epitomized in the relative shrinking of Leander's watery challenge from the Hellespont to the Thames. But if we read Johnson's satire as targeting, in this case, an insistence on cultural sameness, that is, if the object of his satire is people sticking to cultural sameness and not being able to accept the existence of other places and other peoples, in the plural, well, we would be vindicating, therefore, Johnson's inclusion in a Renaissance mindset that some have grounded on the experience of the co-presence of cultures. This is Sanford Budick, in fact, echoing Karl-Heinz Stierle on this. The experience of the co-presence of cultures is perhaps the most important aspect of what we call Renaissance. However, identifying this possible strand within Johnson's satirical denunciation of his audience introduces other complexities. How can we square his implicit sympathy, if we go this way, for an interest in elsewheres as the opposite of the narrow-mindedness that he seems to denounce? How can we relate this to his much-discussed spatial conservatism? If you start browsing Johnson criticism, you will see many people going on about how Ben Jonson was structurally against the idea that you learned anything by traveling or that you could acquire anything by traveling. Only fools did that. So we've got a number of contradictions here that for the moment I'm merely raising, not attempting to sort things out or to settle them today. And yet, a lot happens in Bartlemy Fair that supports the critical venture of reading him against the grain. A key element in this concerns the authority to pass judgment, an authority that Johnson, when he is at his satirically most aggressive, did not hesitate to claim. What I'm trying to say is that in Bartlemy Fair, there are a number of complications that foreground Johnson's interest in display in denying any strident claims for authority as several characters put forward. I realize that we're a bit late, so I'll rush to my ending. And this happens especially in the case of two instances. There are two major characters that try to acquire significant authority within the space of the fair and are discomfited. They are completely humiliated. One of them, let me see if I can fast forward to that. Yeah, we already have it here. It's the Puritan, Zeal of the Land Busy, who allows himself to be persuaded to go to the fair, supposedly to provide spiritual guidance, to the other people who go there. But he's a glutton, and so he is on this, food and drink roamed through the fair, and then becomes, energetic enough to inveigh against the puppet theatre. But he is not clever enough to overcome what Coleridge would have called the willing suspension of disbelief. And so he starts taking the puppets for real people. And he starts disputing with the puppets. But he's previously introduced in these terms, people complaining about how he has moved into the house of the little wits and nearly eats them out of their house. Other characters comment on how he used to be a baker, but now he dreams and sees visions and has given over his trade, with which he used to feed people and contribute to enjoyment and, entertainment. Now he just gives sermons because he's taken a scruple that the cakes he made were served to bridals, maypoles, Morrises, and such profane feasts and meetings, and now he's taken the name Zeal of the Land. And then he inveighs against the puppets. Down with Dagon, 'tis I will no longer endure your profanations. My main argument against you is that you are an abomination, for the male among you putteth on the apparel of the female, and the female of the male. This was, of course, what used to be the accusations against the stage with human actors, since, as you know, before the Restoration, man would be playing the female roles. But the puppet, or the puppet master, immediately replies, you lie abominably. It is your old stale argument against the players, but if you'll not hold against the puppets, for we have neither male nor female amongst us, and that thou mayest see, if thou wilt, like a malicious purblind zeal as thou art. And the puppet lifts the garment, there's nothing there, and Beezy says, I am confuted, the cause hath failed me, So this is the moment of humiliation for the Puritan. The other fundamental moment, and it's the defining one towards the end, comes with the judge. Of course, Johnson had already given him this name Overdue, Adam Overdue. And he's, of course, an Adamic figure also to some extent, standing therefore for the humanum genus, for humankind in general. And what happens is that Overdue believes that he has found, huge conspiracies, those enormities, that he goes on about in the fair. And there's this moment when he addresses the crowd, a great solo moment, in front of the crowd, in which he says, now to my enormities. Look upon me, O London, and see me, O Smithfield, the example of justice and mirror of magistrates, the true top of formality and scourge of enormity. hearken unto my labours, and but observe my discoveries, and compare Hercules with me, if thou darest, of old, or Columbus, Magellan, or our countryman Drake of later times. Stand forth, you weeds of enormity, and spread. And he wants, all the culprits in front of him. Of course, the comic hubris here is evident, when a man like Overdew, who never goes anywhere, is absolutely immobile, dares comparison, with the great navigators of the age of, discoveries. You've got the world there, Columbus, Magellan, and what happens at this moment is that he is both personally and institutionally humiliated, because in front of him, suddenly, his wife emerges completely drunk and vomiting, from a booth in the fair where, without knowing it, she had been socializing with pimps and whores, and drinking a lot. And so the justice's wife emerges from that environment and vomits in front of him right at this moment, when he's giving his great oratio, his great speech. And by the way, that "Look upon me, O London" could be an echo, in fact, of a pamphlet, part of that rogue literature that had come out the previous year in 1613, entitled "Look on me, London," and subtitled "I am an honest Englishman, reaping up the bowels of mischief lurking in the suburbs, in thy suburbs and precincts. Take heed, London, the hangman's halter and the beadle's whip will make the fool dance and the knave to skip." And this pamphlet was written ostensibly by a concerned father to his son who was moving to London. And this was the father advising him, against dicing, against whoring, all those things that the city supposedly had on offer. And there's a lot about hopes that good magistrates, would defend the right causes, etc. Now, Overdew's oratio could, to some extent, be a response to this. And when Overdew is humiliated under the conditions that I was even now describing, the play moves on to a gregarious and absolving happy ending, following this remark by Quallers to the judge: "Remember, you are but Adam, flesh and blood. You have your frailty. Forget your other name of Overdew, and invite us all to supper. There, you and I will compare our discoveries," one of the key words that the judge was always employing, "and drown the memory of all enormity in your biggest bowl at home." Now, of course, Discoveries was also, as you may remember, the title of Johnson's own book of maxims. And it's difficult to believe that this was by chance. Now, to conclude, introducing a collection of essays on translation and cultural difference, Rosanna Warren remarks on the close connection between psychic health and the ability to recognize otherness. And she points out, and I quote, "Our word idiot comes from the Greek word whose primary sense is of privacy, peculiarity, isolation. A person or culture guarding its privacy to an extreme extent becomes idiotic. And such resistance to the foreign, such incapacity to translate, spells its doom." I want to argue that the discomfiture of Overdew's ambition for the distinction of singular, judgmental assertion in front of the mobile crowds at the fair, followed by Qualles's bid for conviviality and acknowledgement of a common humanity, remember you are Adam, etc., that this can be described as, yes, the full achievement of a comic ending, and surely a fitting outcome for a plot that was so strikingly propelled by the fortunes of a text in transit, from classical to vernacular, highbrow to lowbrow, from the cultural rarefactions of antiquity to the multitudinous scenarios of an early modern urban setting. But Qualles's remark to Overdew is also, in more basic terms, a bid for sanity. And that is the point at which idiocy is superseded, providing a vindication of the ability to translate. Thank you.